Welcome to the Restitutor Orbis channel, and we're going to be taking a look at Niagara. One of the reasons that Niagara came across my mind, especially the horseshoe falls that we're looking at here, one of the components of the many falls of Niagara, is the vast amount of potential Tartarian evidence that we have here. We have several historical accounts that inform us that these are great power stations, and yet when we look at these remnants, it almost seems as though they have a different story. Well, just to get you oriented on the particular area that we're talking about, we have explored Buffalo in the past, and now we're just moving northwest of Buffalo with a few short miles distance to Niagara. It should be noted that there is a Niagara Falls, United States in New York, and a Niagara Falls, Canada. And one has to consider the fact that they may have once been the same city, now with an international boundary between them. The points of interest concern the many different falls and culminating in the horseshoe of the Niagara Falls. We also have several power stations that are around the falls here and here. We're also looking a little bit more closer though at some of the older power stations, such as this power station that we'll be looking at in grave detail. And this is part of the Toronto Power Generating Station. And of course, as you can see, it is arranged in the way that you can see a power station would be, with its necessary columns and pediments and unique portal windows everywhere. Once again, why on earth do we have a very clear neoclassical building as a power generating station? Now, I understand the use of neoclassical buildings and the official account that says that they are municipal buildings, they are government buildings, they are capitals, and they have many other uses. And now we're saying it's a power generating station? 1906. So we know that because that's on the building and then that sign on top, which looks very expensive and well produced, with an odd missing icon right there, that this building must be legitimate. And look at the detail here within this window and in the pediment above the door. And it looks as though the columns are actually constructed in different pieces, but still it's a very impressive structure, especially considering that it's a power generating station. At least that's what we're told. And once again, this just feels like it's so absurd with the mainstream account that we really have to question it. For example, why do you need a pediment above this door? Why do you need the portal window? This is just a power generating station. Shouldn't this be an example of something, dare I say, more of a brutalist architecture structure would make sense? Or were they just not advanced enough to do brutalist architecture at the start of the 20th century? Well, all along the falls it's lined with these power stations, and indeed there's other locations that you can look in where you'll see the remnants of power stations, and I think that's what really gets our attention. For example, when we look at this view that was taken from one of the tour boats going through the falls, we can see the clear remnants of a power station over here on the Canadian side of the river. And keep in mind that we're not too far from Buffalo, which is the terminus of the Erie Canal. So if anyone wants to bring up logistical considerations, the answer is, listen, they built the Erie Canal at the start of the 19th century, so if they could do that at the start of the 19th century, anything could be done at the end of the 19th century or the start of the 20th century. And I agree, because that's what the official account always tells us. We're also going to be examining these two very interesting buildings over here. One of these buildings being the Niagara Hotel and the other being the United Office Building, now called the Giacomo Hotel. And it's very interesting seeing how these two buildings line up in conjunction with the falls and all the power stations that we're looking at. We also have numerous accounts of caves and a vast underground that runs along Buffalo. So it seems as though we have many indications of a previous civilization, and no doubt this is what we would summarize as from the Fourth Era civilization. And I think that Niagara, whether you're on the Canadian or the US side, is well worthy of an on-site exploration, and it's certainly worthy of a lot of follow-up explorations and investigation, as we can see where it falls and where it lays. Well, let's start with the Toronto Power Generating Station, built in 1906, and of course this is the very well adorned with what they'd call neoclassical architecture, because the only way to build a power generating station is with neoclassical architecture. It is very well documented that it was easier to build neoclassical architecture in the early 20th century than the 21st century. And the reasons for this is there was a lack of safety standards, everyone had the capability, there were artisans to be found everywhere, and not to mention there were a slew of immigrants who spoke divergent languages, and yet they managed to come to a common understanding and they were able to pull off this very impressive edifice. And this is exactly the kind of building that you need to build if you're going to build a power generating station. And we'll take a look at it from the water side. And of course you can see some of the very details that make perfect sense for a power generating station. I really think that the columns help add something to the appeal. Now, why does this not make any sense from our perspective? We can see older images of this power generating station, and we'll be given many different explanations for why such an edifice was constructed to be a power generating station and why we wouldn't build like this today. And yet when you look at some of the older photos, you're just taken in awe by how detailed and beautiful this power generating station was after it was constructed. It's one of the finest pediments I think I've seen, and look at the portal window there. Apparently it was so well adorned it had to be guarded and protected by members of the Canadian military, to include the Lincolnshire Regiment pictured here. And once again we can see the details of this impressive power generating station. We do have construction photos, and as always we have the usual, very well documented and very clear construction photos. And I had a comment where someone was talking about some of the quality of the photos, and I do find it interesting how when you try to use higher quality or find higher quality, there just tends to be, how shall we say, technical difficulties. Ah, yes. Isn't that exactly how you could envision such a beautiful building being constructed from the very start? And of course, you will not see a single construction photo of the columns, even though these columns apparently came in sections. So I'm not exactly sure why. Again, it was probably the same reason why you don't get pictures of establishing the foundation. It's just very boring, and who would actually want to see that? Looking at the aerials, though, you're again given a different impression of what this building could have originally been used for. Was this actually some sort of administrative building originally in the older civilization, or did it have some other function? Obviously, it was repurposed to some other function, and then we believe that it was transferred to being a power generating station. But why exactly would they select this to be a power generating station? It's all very intriguing. And it really gets to be absurd when you look at this side. Because was this building itself somehow involved in power generation itself? Was that its architectural function? And here we have the image of the good old Packard truck from the 1920s hauling one of these large generators. And for some reason this generator looks very out of place within this particular structure. We'll just wait until we look on the inside of it. We do have more of our very well documented and very convincing construction photos supposedly. I'm not exactly sure what's going on here that's involved with the construction of this power generating station. I'm sure we'll be told there's some reason behind it. And yet, with some of the other photos that looks like they're actually working on it, you get the impression that the foundation and the original materials have already been there for some unknown number of years, and all that's really occurring looks to be like a cleanup, or a restoration even. I'm sure that's not what's happening, but I think to the great Keokuk power station that we looked at down in Iowa, which was only built about 7 years after this, according to our mainstream account. And here you go again. You have the same issue, though, with a lot of these so-called construction photos, because you just have people standing around and magical machines are just making magic happen in a very limited amount of time. And while that might sound dismissive or flippant, it's a story that we hear time and time again. It's also intriguing that we don't have a better chronological arrangement of the photos. And it's also fascinating that if they were building or involved in one of the largest hydroelectric stations at the time, you would think they would have done a better job of actually, well documenting it, chronologically, having the photos labeled step by step, instead of giving us the hand wave. And of course there's a reason for that. Well, photos were lost over time, people didn't always appreciate history. And look at some of these tunnels here. The junction of the tunnel site, Toronto Power Plant, nearing completion. Does that really look like they just built that? Or does that look like something that's already been there? And we can compare and contrast it with a much more recent image taken by urban explorers. Now, we could just say that that was just recently built, in 2023, and just arrange a bunch of debris on the floor and say that we actually built it in 2023. And then, of course, you have different images of the photos, and no one would question it. Well, you have the good old cornerstone laying photo, and of course that should convince you that, yes, this power generating station was really constructed in 1906. Stop asking questions and just move on. And if you really need evidence that we actually built this, here is your single perspective schematic, because that's all you need to build a building. Just like you only need a single perspective schematic or a two perspective schematic for a patent. Yes. And I'm sure that any ingenious engineer just seeing this image alone could completely and very easily replicate this building from start to finish, because that's exactly what we'll be expected to believe, and will be mocked for saying otherwise. Here's another one of the power generating stations, and we can see that they have it labeled off, and yet somehow this gives the impression of being far older, even if it was built towards the end of the 19th century. Here you go. Here's your plaque. And of course the plaque will tell you exactly what happened and why you should believe the official historical account. And it also helps educate you to make sure that you know the official historical account and you don't ask foolish questions on your own. And then of course we have King George and Queen Elizabeth attending. And in the background you can actually see the wonderful Toronto power generating station. I'm sure they were awed and impressed by it, and I'm sure Queen Elizabeth didn't ask any questions like, why are there marble appearing walls and neoclassical architecture around generators? That doesn't make so much sense. No, I'm sure she didn't ask any of those kind of questions, nor did the king. They were probably just having a grand old time. This is the actual Niagara power generating station, and even though it's an old world building, at least we can perhaps believe it being a little bit more of a functional power generating station, at least from what we would traditionally believe, and based on our background. There are so many tunnels and so many passageways with an unbelievable number of bricks. And where exactly did they get these bricks? Were these all manufactured in St. Louis at the time after that nasty riverboat fire that they had? Oh, and it's not just bricks, you also have very large blocks that make up a lot of these tunnels. And when exactly were a lot of these tunnels constructed? Now, we'll be told that this entire site has been augmented and added onto, but when you see photos like this, you can see what looks to be much older blocks that have been there for a very long period of time. How old is the bridge? How old is this overlook? And how old are the blocks that are in the immediate foreground in front of us? And then again, we still have older images of the old power generating stations, and we have images of the mills that used to be there as well that had to be destroyed to make way for the new power generating stations. It just goes on and on and on. I would like to walk through this tunnel and really get an idea of what this looks like. Now, why am I making such a big deal over these tunnels? Well, because excavating these tunnels is not exactly the easiest of tasks. Unless, of course, we're simply to take the word that in the 19th century, they had the logistical cheat code. And we can see that the so-called modern power generating stations on the Niagara Falls area have all been built on top of the existing infrastructure. And this is one of the older stations in Niagara Falls. And of course we have a very good story, a very good historical account that tells us and shows us that it's very well documented. And that's this individual, Jacob F. Scholkopf, 1819 to 1899, and he was the hydroelectric power guru of Buffalo, New York. Another German, those Germans at it again in the United States. Now, interestingly enough, he started as running his own tannery business and then somehow ascended to building the largest facilities of hydroelectric power and mills around the Niagara Falls area. And here you can see the remnants of one of them being destroyed. Very interesting and unique architecture. Do we really take all this at face value that he was the one responsible for this? And we can see these very massive generators once again in these wide array of power generating stations. Are these our generators, or are these generators that we simply revived, renewed, and repaired, and restored to operation? Indeed, when we see a lot of the imagery here, we once again have the same kind of impression that we do when we look at the old architecture all across the land. We see what appears to be something of a different function than what we're told. And here you can see one of the most glaring examples of the new infrastructure, at least newer, built on top of the older infrastructure. So you have the impression that there's multiple civilizations that are apparent in both Buffalo and Niagara Falls. And here's yet another example of it. So how long has all this existing power generating infrastructure been here? And was it originally for power generation, or did it serve a wide variety of other purposes? Indeed, this is how we would excavate today and establish tunnels with a very large tunneling machine, which is very difficult to operate, and it takes a lot of time, especially clearing away all the rubble. And granted, it's easier for us, we would expect, because we have large machinery like this. We have motorized and mechanized transportation that would make removing the rubble relatively easy. And yet nothing that we do with what we've dug compares to what exists in the past with the existing tunnels that were built brick by brick by brick. Take a guess on how many bricks you see in this particular picture. And again, this goes back to the whole tunnel concept of all these tunnels that runs under Niagara Falls. And yet you don't just see bricks, you also see larger blocks and signs of more advanced construction. And are we to just believe that even though heavy machineries were in their infancy, according to our official historical account in 1890, that they managed to pull off all these stunning excavation and tunnel construction achievements? Again, you're hand-waving away the logistical challenge. And I understand that's exactly what we're told to do. It's not really a problem. They could have done it back at that time because they worked harder, they had no safety standards, and again, they had the logistical cheat code in the 19th century. It wasn't quite as good as the logistical cheat code in the 18th century, but it was still good enough to achieve all these wondrous construction of tunnels. And here you see that earlier image that we looked at that was supposedly documenting the construction. And I posit to you, how difficult would it be to throw debris in the middle of that tunnel and say it was just being built in 2023? Who would even question it? And that's always the challenge that you have when you look at these older photos, regardless of their quality, is have they been manipulated? And even if they haven't, how do you know the account with the photo is accurate? And again, that's something that we tend to take at face value. Because think about just the sheer manufacture of all these bricks, and then the logistical transportation, and even if the brick manufacturer was located right next to the Niagara Falls, or wherever the bricks are being established, you still have to go through the labor of moving every single brick, placing every single brick, and then making sure that these structures endure. And how long have these subterranean structures truly endured? We even go to this example of this cave that we have. We'll be told this is Cave of the Winds, which is apparently a tourist attraction from the 1830s. Yes, I said the 1830s. And it was unfortunately closed in the 1950s because it just collapsed. And then they had to dynamite it because it was unsafe. Because, you know, in the 1950s, we cared about safety more than we did in the 1830s to the 1890s, apparently. Again, there are remnants of what you can still tour on these particular caves and what's left of it. And you can get a good view of the falls. What I'm wondering, though, with all this account that we have of caves and existing subterranean structures, and then even here on the side of this face, is this actually the remnant of an old building? Well, when we look at the other photos, one would be forgiven for thinking that, yes, this is the remnant of an artificial structure. And here's another photo from these caves during the wintertime, because I guess nobody had anything better to do at that time than to go putzing around with their top hats on and their coats and exploring ice-covered caves. So what's really the story behind this photo? And as if it's not enough with the Cave of the Winds in New York, you also have this nice old-world building that runs right to the elevator. So it seems to give multiple indications that you have true hardline evidence here in Niagara Falls that there were previous civilizations, and you can see the remnants everywhere that you look. Now, I suspect that these are primarily 4th era civilization remains, but there could be the remains of other civilizations, especially considering the subterranean chambers. Now let's consider Hotel Niagara, built 1923 to 1925, and this is an example of 19th and 20th century revival architecture. What? 20th century revival architecture in the 20th century? That doesn't exactly make a lot of sense. And really the architecture behind this building doesn't really make a lot of sense. It's very impressive, and we see the great foundation stones fit well together. I like how they seem to have tasked the lions' heads there with holding up that very cheap-looking awning. For some reason, this building reminds me of some of the buildings that I've seen in Austria. And of course the explanation will be, well, of course, because all the immigrants came over there and they built a building just like that. And it was very easy. And then you can see the United Office building next to the Hotel Niagara. Two very impressive structures in the city of Niagara Falls in New York. And we haven't even considered the Canadian side. We'll be getting to that in a subsequent exploration. This is Frank A. Dudley, a Knight Templar Mason. I never knew such a thing existed. Noble of the Mystic Shriner Order, or Shriner, son of the American Revolution, and a member of the New York National Guard. And he was the businessman, lawyer, politician who was responsible for building both those buildings. Now you're probably asking, okay, great, why do you mention the fact that he was a member of the New York National Guard? Well, because this was their armory in Niagara. You just can't make this stuff up. It seems the more you dig into it and the more you look, you always find more examples of old world architecture. And the Hotel Niagara does not disappoint. And it's a building that defies the usual classification that we have for architectural styles, so they just say, yes, it's 19th and 20th century revival. In the 20th century. Ha ha ha, joke's on you. Apparently this hotel was closed for a long period of time and they're working on remodeling it, but even after being in neglect for years, once again, it's an example of a building that you can see its past glory. It's also impressive that they're capable of renovating it and that it stood the test of time for so long. It's clear that this was once a very beautiful structure, although it had quite a great challenge of locating contemporary interior photos from, say, the 1920s and the 1930s. Fortunately for Mr. Dudley, he managed to jump on that building boom that occurred across the entire United States in the 1920s when they basically built all the great Art Deco skyscrapers in every city across the country in a very short amount of time. Because again, logistics were not a problem, you had skilled laborers everywhere, and you had an infinite amount of people and an infinite amount of money. Oh, and no safety standards, let's not forget that. I'm rather impressed though by the remnants that you see in this building, even after its neglect. Well, now we go to the United Office Building, now the Giacomo Hotel, built in 1929, and this is an interesting one. It's Art Deco, but it's Mayan Revival. Yes, we actually had a style of Art Deco called Mayan Revival. And why, you might ask? Because there's Mayan inscriptions on it. Wait till we take a closer look. I included this photo. I'm not sure how well this image is an actual photo, but it's very impressive, and it reminds me of the Plummer Building in Rochester. The way that many of these Art Deco buildings just glow. And then this postcard, how they just threw up that sign United on top of that. Doesn't that look really cheap and tacky? So they just gone through all this effort of constructing this incredible building, and then they're going to put a really cheap sign on top of it that says United. Very fitting. Now on the top of the building, as with most Art Deco buildings, you can see some of the examples of the Mayan inscriptions, and they are extremely impressive. And yes, when we look closer at them, you'll really get the impression that they are actual Mayan impressions, or artwork, or whatever you want to call it. Here's our one construction photo of it. Yes, another very convincing construction photo. What's with the tarps anyway? Is that some kind of tarp technique or method of pouring the concrete, or the terracotta, as they say? They tell us that this is a steel building, which is rather laughable, I think, because I don't think there's really much steel in this building at all. But, you know, if the mainstream account says so, who am I to argue with it? And now we look a little bit closer, and this is what they'll call, or what they'll tell us is the terracotta part of the building. And here you can see some very interesting symbols. What is the symbolism behind this building? And of course you'll be told, well, it's Mayan Revival. Because when you look a little bit closer, especially towards the top of the building, you'll see many of the reliefs that reflect what we'd be told, or what we understand to be Mayan figures. So just don't ask the question, why in the heck would a guy who had absolutely no affiliation with anything Mayan want to adorn his wonderful building with Mayan figures? How exactly does that make any sense? If he was a member of the Knights Templar Mason Order, wouldn't he not want to put figures of Knights Templars up there? You know, potentially to revive their shattered reputation over the years? Or something else, something more American, more patriotic, since he was a member of the Sons of the American Revolution? Oh no, you're going to put Mayan figures up there because clearly many people across the United States had a deep respect for Mayan architecture. And it was part of the neoclassical time. It didn't come up any other time, before or after, but it was part of, well, not neoclassical, but Art Deco. Now you can see how all these terms get confused. Bottom line up front, just don't focus on what you're seeing right in front of your own eyes. Don't focus on the anomaly that you see, that there are Mayan figures right in front of you in a United States city. And they were built and put on there in the 1920s. And you can see them everywhere you look. Yes, this is quite an anomaly, and this is something that stands out here in Niagara Falls. And remember, we're not that far from Buffalo, which we explored earlier. Unfortunately, this building has been turned into a hotel, and you can still get an idea for some of its past glory. And isn't it intriguing how we have all these old world buildings that seem to be turned into hotels now, to include insane asylums, and we've looked at that. It looks like some of the remnants of the interior were not changed over time. But we suspect that the real reason that they do this is just so that they can change around the interior look of the building and nobody asks any questions. Although you can still get an idea in the entryway of what the greater glory of this building once was. And you can gain an appreciation for the actual civilization that I suspect that was really responsible for building it. Unless we just want to accept our mainstream account. And look, if you want to believe all that, that's perfectly fine. I'm just presenting an alternate view for things that don't make sense. Because you'll find plenty of examples if you look up this Mayan Revival subset of Art Deco of these structures all across the United States, and they're everywhere. So why exactly did that suddenly become a thing? And yet, interestingly enough, when you look up Art Deco, you won't see any mention of Mayan revival. You'll see something about, well, it's kind of a mix of every style from every culture, and Egyptian, but not Mayan. Well, yeah, Mayan too. I mean, it's just amazing. You say something, then you backtrack, and you say something else. So, well, I hope you enjoyed this exploration of Niagara Falls. Thanks for joining me. Please like, comment, and subscribe.